The morning Samuel Sutton rode into the valley with a land dispute notice folded in his breast pocket. He had no idea the woman waiting at the end of that rutted road would turn out to be the most stubborn, capable, and quietly devastating person he had ever encountered in all his 31 years of living. The Kansas plains in the spring of 1874 were a study in contradictions. Vast stretches of grass so green it almost hurt to look at them, cut through with dry creek beds and the occasional spill of wildflowers, all of it existing under a sky so wide and blue it made a man feel small in the most humbling possible way. Samuel had ridden through 3 counties already that week, delivering notices on behalf of the Dodge City Land Office where he worked as a claims surveyor, a job that had earned him a modest living and a reputation for fairness but not many friends. People did not, as a general rule, enjoy seeing a surveyor ride up to their door. It usually meant someone somewhere had filed a competing claim on land they'd already broken their backs clearing and plowing. He found the Brenner homestead at the end of a long drive marked by 2 fence posts that had been freshly painted white, which struck him as an oddly civilized detail in the middle of so much raw country. A kitchen garden ran along the south side of the house, its rows neat and straight. Someone had planted sunflowers along the fence line, a domestic touch that looked deliberate rather than accidental, as though whoever lived here intended to stay and intended it to be beautiful. The cabin itself was small but solid, built with the kind of careful attention to corners and joints that spoke of someone who either knew what they were doing or had learned fast. A lean-to barn stood 20 feet behind the house, and from inside it came the sound of something being hammered with steady, unhurried purpose. Samuel tied his horse to the fence post, pushed his hat back on his head, and walked toward the barn because that was where the sound was coming from, and standing around waiting in someone's yard felt like bad manners regardless of the news he was carrying. He stepped into the shadow of the barn and stopped. A woman was working at a wooden workbench that ran along the barn's back wall, driving nails into what appeared to be a window frame with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this kind of work for a long time. She was perhaps 27, though it was hard to be certain, with dark red hair pinned up underneath a worn straw hat, a canvas work apron over a faded blue dress, and the sleeves of her dress rolled to the elbow. She did not look up when he came in. She drove another nail, turned the frame 90 degrees, examined the joint, and reached for another nail. "Whatever you are selling," she said without looking up, "I am not buying." "I'm not selling anything," Samuel said. She did look up then, and her eyes were the color of pale amber, the kind of clear light brown that shifted to green in certain lights, and they were also extraordinarily direct. She looked at him the way people looked at weather on the horizon, measuring, assessing, not yet alarmed but paying close attention. "You're from the land office," she said. It was not a question. Samuel touched the brim of his hat. "Samuel Sutton. I'm a claims surveyor out of Dodge City, ma'am." "Opal Brenner," she said. She set the hammer down and straightened. "And I figured it was only a matter of time." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the folded notice. "Mrs. Brenner, Miss Brenner," she corrected, pleasantly enough. "My husband passed the winter before last." "I'm sorry," Samuel said, and he meant it. She crossed the barn to where he stood and took the notice from his hand with the matter-of-fact gesture of a woman who had learned to accept difficult things without flinching. She unfolded it and read it slowly, her lips pressed together, her expression giving nothing away. The barn was quiet except for the sound of her breathing and the distant sound of meadowlarks outside. "Harland Cass," she said when she had finished reading. "Yes, ma'am." She folded the notice again, very precisely, along its original creases, and handed it back to him. "He has filed a competing claim on 160 acres that overlap the eastern portion of my homestead filing." "That's correct." "On the grounds that my original filing contained an error in the survey description of the eastern boundary." "That is what his filing alleges." Opal Brenner looked at Samuel Sutton for a long, steady moment. There was no panic in her face, no tears forming, no trembling of the hands that were now resting easily at her sides. There was instead a quality of absolute settled resolve that was, he found, somewhat difficult to look away from. "Mr. Sutton," she said, "I have been rival to worse than Harland Cass, and I imagine you can see from looking around this place that I am not the kind of woman who gives up a thing she has earned." He believed her. Completely and immediately, without reservation. He did not, however, tell her that. He was there to deliver a notice, not to take sides, and he had a professional obligation to remain neutral in land disputes regardless of his personal feelings about the parties involved. He told her that the land office would require a formal survey to resolve the boundary question, that she had 30 days to respond to the competing claim in writing, and that she should consider consulting the county seat for legal assistance. He said all of this in his careful, measured surveyor's voice, and she listened to every word with the same focused attention she had given to her window frame, and when he was finished, she nodded and thanked him and showed him out of the barn with perfect courtesy. He rode back to the main road, and for the first time in 3 years of delivering notices he found himself turning in the saddle to look back. She was already back in the barn. He could hear the hammer. He rode 14 miles before he stopped thinking about her eyes. He did not sleep particularly well that night, which was unusual for him. Samuel Sutton was by nature and necessity a practical man. He had grown up on a working farm in Ohio, come west at the age of 24 with a good head for mathematics and a surveying kit he'd saved 2 years to purchase, and had built himself a quiet and competent life in Dodge City doing work that he was genuinely skilled at, and that served a real purpose. He did not generally spend his nights restless over the people he delivered notices to. It was nothing personal. It was simply the law, and the law required that competing claims be filed and processed and adjudicated according to the rules of the General Land Office, and that was all there was to it. Except that the eastern boundary question in Opal Brenner's filing had struck him as a genuine error in the original survey rather than a deliberate fraud, and the timing of Harland Cass's competing claim, filed just 11 months after her homestead entry, had a smell to it that he did not particularly care for. He knew Cass by reputation. Most people in that part of Kansas knew Cass by reputation. He was a rancher of the old sort, a man who had arrived in the territory before the Homestead Act had opened it to small family claims, and who regarded the whole enterprise of homesteading as an imposition on the natural order of things, which in his view consisted of open range controlled by cattle operations of significant size. Cass had filed 3 other competing claims in the past 2 years, all of them against small homesteaders, and 2 of those homesteaders had packed up and left. The third had hired a lawyer and spent the better part of a year in county court proceedings before his claim was confirmed. That homesteader was a married man with grown sons and money enough to weather a legal battle. Opal Brenner was a widow alone. Samuel pulled out his field notebook in the gray early morning and looked at the measurements he had taken at her place the previous week in preparation for delivering the notice. He had surveyed the eastern boundary himself. The original filing had a description error. Yes, whoever had done the initial survey had transcribed a bearing incorrectly, so that on paper the eastern boundary line fell about 40 feet further west than the actual corner stakes on the ground suggested it should. But the corner stakes themselves were clearly original, clearly old, and clearly consistent with the land she had been occupying, improving, and farming for 3 years. The error was a clerical one. The stakes told the real story. He ate his breakfast, saddled his horse, and rode back to the Brenner homestead. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, kneeling in the dirt between rows of early beans, pulling weeds with the practiced efficiency he was already beginning to recognize as characteristic of everything she did. She heard the horse and stood, shading her eyes with one hand even though it was still early enough that the sun was behind her. "Mr. Sutton," she said. There was no surprise in her voice, but there was a question in it. "I want to look at your original corner stakes," he said. She studied him for a moment. "Why?" "Because I think the boundary error in your filing is a transcription error in the survey description, not an error in the actual survey. If I'm right about that, your claim can be corrected without surrendering the disputed acreage." She looked at him for another moment, those amber eyes doing their measuring, assessing work, and then she wiped her hands on her apron and said, "The eastern stakes are about half a mile that way," pointing. "The creek is the natural boundary. My husband staked along the creek when we filed." "Did your husband do the original survey?" "He hired a man named Peterson out of the county seat. Peterson came out for 2 days. "Does Peterson still practice in the county?" "He does, though I heard he was ailing last winter." "I'd like to ride the eastern boundary with you if you're willing. And if you have any documentation from Peterson, any original notes or descriptions, I'd like to see them." Opal pulled off her gardening gloves and tucked them through the apron strings at her hip. "I have the original survey notes," she said. "Jacob kept everything. Every piece of paper that came through this place, he kept it in a wooden box under the bed. I have not gotten rid of any of it." Something in the way she said this, the simplicity of it, the absence of self-pity, made Samuel feel something shift in his chest, the way a floorboard shifts under your weight, and you notice it even though it holds perfectly. "May I see them?" he asked. She nodded and walked to the house, and he tied his horse and followed her inside. The cabin was one large room with a sleeping alcove curtained off at the back. It was spare but not bare. A cast iron stove with a kettle on it, a good solid table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised him, and a framed photograph on the wall that he would have liked to look at longer but did not because it was not his business. She knelt beside the bed and pulled a flat wooden box from underneath it and set it on the table and opened it, and he sat down across from her, and together they went through it. Jacob Brenner, whoever he had been, had indeed kept everything. There were receipts for seed and lumber and nails, a letter from a sister in Missouri, the original Homestead entry papers, and at the bottom, folded in oilskin, Peterson's original survey field notes. Samuel unfolded them with the careful hands of a man who handled important papers regularly and read them slowly, and then read them again. "There it is," he said, mostly to himself. "Where what is?" Opal asked. She was leaning forward slightly across the table, and he could smell the fresh outdoor scent of her hair and the clean green smell of the garden dirt still on her hands. "Peterson wrote 2 different bearing notations for the eastern boundary," Samuel said. "Here, in the field notes, he wrote north 43 degrees east. Here in the final description he submitted to the land office, he wrote north 43 degrees west. That is a transcription error. His field notes are the controlling document, and the field notes match your corner stakes." Opal sat very still. "What does that mean?" she asked, in a voice that was quieter than her usual one. "It means Cass's competing claim is based on the corrected survey description, not on the original field notes. If we can submit Peterson's field notes to the land office along with a corrected survey description, your claim should be confirmed as originally intended." He paused. "I will need to get Peterson to sign a correction affidavit, or if he cannot, I will need to file a correction notice on the basis of the field notes alone. Either way, this is correctable." Opal Brenner sat back in her chair slowly, as though she were releasing a breath she had been holding for an extremely long time. She looked down at the field notes spread on the table between them, and then she looked up at Samuel, and for just a moment her expression was not the steady, composed thing it usually was. It was something younger and more open, something that was almost surprise, almost relief, almost the beginning of a feeling she was not quite letting herself have yet. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because the error is real and correctable, and because your claim is a good faith one and Cass knows it." "That is a professional answer," she said. "It is the professional answer," he agreed. He did not give her any other kind, because it was too soon and he was not entirely sure himself what the other kind might be, only that it existed somewhere in his chest and was making his voice slightly more careful than usual. She nodded slowly. "What do I need to do?" "Let me ride your eastern boundary and remeasure the corner stakes," he said, "and write down everything you remember about when and how your husband staked the claim." "I was here," she said. "I remember all of it. Jacob and I staked it together. Then we have a strong case." She rose to put the kettle on, the movement efficient and graceful, and said, "You will have coffee before you ride, Mr. Sutton." It was not a question either. They rode the eastern boundary together that morning, Opal on a steady brown mare she called Juniper, and Samuel on his road-worn gray gelding. She knew the land the way people know a place they have worked with their own hands. She knew where the creek ran shallow enough to cross easily, and where the bank was undercut by the spring floods. She knew where her husband had sunk the corner stakes into the red clay of the creek side. She knew the names she had given to particular landmarks because she needed to navigate this land alone, and names helped. She told him these things without self-consciousness as they rode, and he wrote in his field notebook and asked questions, and found himself listening to far more than the survey data. She had come west from St. Louis with her husband Jacob 5 years ago, in the spring of 1869. She had been 23 then, Jacob 26. They had filed on 160 acres under the Homestead Act, built the cabin their first summer, put in the first crop their second spring. Jacob had died of a fever in February of 1872, the winter being the second one they spent in the cabin, which was also the winter they had gotten it fully finished and thought themselves safe from the worst of the cold. She had stayed. She had her reasons, and she did not enumerate them, but they were visible in every fence post and garden row and neat-jointed window frame. Samuel found the corner stakes exactly where she said they were, measuring from them with his transit and his chain, and confirmed what Peterson's field notes had told him. The bearing was north 43 east, consistent with the creek line, and the resulting boundary placed the eastern edge of her claim exactly where she said it was, and exactly 22 yards further east than the erroneous description would have placed it. Harland Cass had filed his claim on those 22 yards and a great deal more that he surely knew belonged to her. "The measurements are exactly as I expected," Samuel told her as they sat their horses at the last stake. The creek ran behind them, silver and busy over its shallow rocks, and the sun was well past noon now, throwing long shadows through the cottonwoods along the bank. "And is it enough?" she asked. "It should be," he said. "I won't tell you it will be easy. Cass has money and a lawyer, and he will not withdraw the competing claim without pressure. But the field notes are clear and the stakes are consistent, and I will file a correction notice on your behalf with my own survey measurements attached." She looked at him in that direct way that he was beginning to look forward to, even though it unsettled him slightly. "Why?" she asked again. She seemed to genuinely want to understand his motivation. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, "and because I am a surveyor and not a tool for land theft." He paused. "I know that may sound, it sounds like exactly what it is," she said, "and I am grateful for it." They rode back to the house in a comfortable silence that surprised him, because silences with people he had known only a few hours were not usually comfortable. She made him stay for the noon meal, which consisted of cornbread and salt pork and the first spring onions from her garden, and they ate at the table where they had spread Jacob's papers that morning, and she asked him about his work and about Ohio, and he asked her about her garden and about the books on the shelf. And by the time he rode out that afternoon the sun was low and gold, and he was aware of having spent the entire day in her company, and finding it considerably preferable to anything else he might have been doing. It took him 3 weeks to build the case. He rode to the county seat and found Peterson, who was ailing but lucid and deeply irritated, when he heard that his transcription error had been used as the basis of a competing claim against a widow woman's homestead. Peterson signed the correction affidavit with a hand that shook from illness, but was firm enough in its intention. And he added to it a sworn statement that the corner stakes along the creek had been placed precisely as his field notes described. The man was not long for this world. Samuel could see that plainly, but he was clear-minded and his principles were intact, and he stated them in the affidavit with the formal precision of someone who wanted the record to be right before he was not there to speak for it himself. Samuel filed the correction notice with the Dodge City Land Office along with his own survey measurements, Peterson's affidavit, the original field notes, and a formal brief explaining the nature of the transcription error. He filed it in his own name as the correcting surveyor, which meant he was formally on record as supporting Opal Brenner's claim, which meant any competent lawyer for Harland Cass would know immediately that the competing claim was going to have a harder time than Cass had anticipated. He heard from Cass's lawyer within the week. The lawyer's name was Whitmore, a sharp-faced man who had come down from Wichita and who had the careful, polished manner of someone who had learned to be persuasive without being obviously threatening. He came to the land office and asked Samuel to meet him for a drink at the Dodge House Saloon, and Samuel said he would listen to what the man had to say. What the man had to say was that Harland Cass was prepared to drop the competing claim on all but the outermost 40 acres of the disputed land, and that this offer was being made in the spirit of neighborly compromise, and that Mr. Cass greatly respected Mr. Sutton's professional reputation, and hoped that this matter could be resolved without further involvement of the formal adjudication process. Samuel set down his glass. The outermost 40 acres include Mrs. Brenner's best winter pasture, he said. Mr. Cass knows that. I'm sure a practical arrangement. The corner stakes are original, Samuel said. Peterson's field notes are signed and dated. My own survey confirms the bearing. There is no version of this dispute in which Mr. Cass's claim is on solid ground, and Mr. Whitmore, you and I both know that. He picked up his glass again. Tell your client to withdraw. Whitmore smiled a thin smile. Mr. Sutton, I wonder if you are fully aware of Mr. Cass's standing in this county. I am aware of it, Samuel said. I am also aware that the General Land Office in Washington does not care about a rancher's standing in a single county. The documentation I have filed is federal. The adjudication, if it comes to that, will be federal, and the documentation I have filed will win. He finished his drink and left. He rode to Opal's homestead that same afternoon, not because he had any particular new information to give her, but because he had told her he would keep her informed of developments, and this was a development. He told himself it was only professional courtesy. She was mending harness on the front step when he rode up, the long straps of leather draped across her lap and a curved needle in her hand, and she looked up when she heard the horse, and her expression did something that he chose not to examine too carefully. It opened briefly, in a way that suggested she had not been entirely indifferent to whether he came back. You've been busy, she said. I have. He dismounted and tied the horse and came to sit on the step beside her, not quite close enough to be improper, but close enough that he could have reached out and touched the leather harness in her lap if he had any excuse to. He told her about Peterson, about the affidavit, about the correction filing, about Whitmore and the conversation at the saloon. She listened to all of it with that focused quality of hers, the needle still in her hand but not moving, and when he was finished she sat quietly for a moment. He will not give up just because a lawyer's approach failed, she said. No, Samuel agreed. I don't expect he will, but the formal case is strong. What will he do next? She was not frightened, he noted. She was strategic. He may try to intimidate through other means, Samuel said carefully. Men like Cass sometimes use informal pressure. I want you to be aware of that. She turned the curved needle over in her fingers, looking at it thoughtfully. Mr. Sutton, she said, I came to this territory with a husband, a wagon, $200, and enough sense to know that neither the land nor the people on it were going to be easy. I spent the first winter in a soddy we cut from the creek bank because the cabin was not finished. I buried Jacob in February. I put in the spring crop alone because I could not afford to hire anyone. I have had 3 separate encounters with men who thought a woman alone on good land was an invitation to help themselves. She paused, and the needle stilled. I do not say this to impress you. I say it because you seem like a man who would rather know the truth of a situation than be protected from it. I would, Samuel said. He was looking at her profile in the late afternoon light, the clean line of her jaw, the way a strand of dark red hair had worked loose from her hat and was lying against her neck. And I am not surprised by any of what you have said. I am only sorry that those things were necessary. Some of them were good things, she said, with a slight shift in her expression that was not quite a smile but was something warmer than her usual composure. The first spring was hard, but it was also the land was beautiful, and it was ours, and we were building something. That part was good. They sat in a quiet that was full of things that were not yet being said. I will keep filing on your behalf, Samuel said, eventually, and I will keep checking in. If Cass or anyone connected to him causes you any direct trouble, I want you to send word to the land office. I can usually be reached there. I will, she said. He stood to go, and she stood with him, and they were both standing in the long light of late afternoon on the step of her small, solid cabin, and he was aware of the exact distance between them, and the fact that he did not entirely want to close it yet, because closing it would have meant admitting things he was not yet sure how to say to a woman who had lost so much, and who deserved not to have anything else happen too fast. "Thank you, Samuel," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He put his hat on. "Opal," he said, and that was all, but she heard it for what it was. The formal land office adjudication took 2 months to schedule, and in those 2 months, Samuel found himself making reasons to ride out to the Brenner homestead with the regularity of a man who was not yet willing to admit that the reasons he was giving himself were not the real reason. He told himself the first visit was to check that no one had tampered with her corner stakes. They had not, but he walked the eastern boundary with her anyway, and she showed him where the wild plums were coming into bloom along the creek, white blossoms against green-brown wood, and she picked a stem and handed it to him without ceremony as they walked back, and he carried it all the way back to Dodge City before he realized he was still holding it. He told himself the second visit was to bring her a copy of the formal correction filing for her own records, which was true, but was also something he could have sent by post. She made him coffee, and they sat at the table with Jacob's papers and went over the filing together, and she asked sharp, clear questions about the legal language and understood his answers quickly, and without needing them, explained twice. And he found himself thinking that it was rare and valuable to talk to someone who was genuinely interested in the substance of what you were saying rather than the fact that you were saying it. The third visit, he came on a Sunday afternoon in late May and made no pretense of professional purpose. He rode up to find her sitting on the step in the sun reading one of her books, her hat off and her dark red hair loose around her shoulders since there was no one to see it, and she looked up when he came, and for a moment neither of them said anything because the situation was clear enough to render words temporarily unnecessary. "You do not have a land office reason today," she said. "No," he admitted. He was still on his horse, which felt like it gave him an option he was not sure he was going to take. She set her book down on the step. "Then get down from that horse, Samuel Sutton," she said, with a slight shift in her expression that he had been thinking about at inconvenient moments for 2 months, "and come sit in the sun." He got down from the horse. They sat on the step together, and she picked up her book and read to him, not asking whether he wanted her to, just reading, from a novel by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe that had been published 20 years ago and that he had never read. Her voice reading was different from her speaking voice, a little deeper, a little more musical, as though reading allowed her to release something she kept under careful management otherwise. He listened to the story, and he watched the shadow of the cottonwood at the corner of the yard move slowly across the ground as the afternoon passed, and somewhere in the middle of the fourth chapter, he put his arm along the step behind her and she leaned back against it very slightly, just enough to acknowledge it, and kept reading, and neither of them said a word about it. He stayed until the light began to go and then helped her bring in her chickens, because the hawk she had been watching all afternoon was getting more ambitious, and they chased chickens together around the yard in the golden last light, both of them laughing at the particular dignity that chickens maintained even while being herded, and it was one of the best hours of his adult life, and he knew it clearly even as it was happening. He rode home in the dark, and for the first time in 2 months of restless nights he slept deeply and well. On the 22nd of June, the land office adjudication hearing was held in the county courthouse in Dodge City. Samuel had written a formal brief that was, by his own honest assessment, the most thorough and precise document he had produced in his professional career. He had Peterson's affidavit, his own corrected survey measurements, the original field notes in their oilskin wrapper, and a clear chain of evidence that established beyond reasonable question that the eastern boundary of Opal Brenner's homestead filing was exactly where her corner stakes placed it. Opal arrived at the courthouse in the best dress she owned, a dark blue wool that she had clearly pressed carefully that morning, with her hair up under a good hat, and she looked, Samuel thought, like someone who had considered the weight of this moment and decided to meet it dressed for it. She sat at the claimant's table with a composure that was not coldness but was instead a form of concentrated strength, and when the adjudicator, a lean, formal man from the Wichita district office named Harrison, came in and called the hearing to order, she looked at him with the full, focused attention she gave to everything. Whitmore made the case for Cass's competing claim with professional thoroughness, citing the erroneous survey description and arguing that the corner stakes had been placed incorrectly. He called no witnesses. He had no documentary evidence beyond the erroneous description itself, which, as Samuel had told Cass's lawyer at the saloon, was the document they already knew contained a demonstrable error. Samuel presented the correction case. He was methodical and clear. He walked Harrison through the field notes line by line, showed him the bearing discrepancy between the field notes and the final description, presented his own measurements, and then submitted Peterson's affidavit. Harrison read the affidavit slowly, read it a second time, and then looked up. "The transcription error is evident on the face of the documents," Harrison said. "The field notes predate the final description and are the controlling authority. The corner stakes are consistent with the field notes and inconsistent with the erroneous description." He looked at Whitmore. "Is there any documentary evidence to the contrary?" Whitmore acknowledged there was not. Harrison ruled in favor of Opal Brenner's original filing as corrected. Harland Cass's competing claim was dismissed. The order was signed and dated and sealed before the end of the morning. Opal sat very still for a moment after the ruling, as though she were making sure she had heard it correctly, and then she set both hands flat on the table and pressed them down as if she needed the solid surface of it. Samuel, seated beside her, saw her shoulders drop slightly, not slump, but release a tension that had been held there for 3 months. He leaned over and said, very quietly, "It is done." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright in a way they had not been before, not tears exactly but something at their edges, and she said just as quietly, "I know. I heard." Outside the courthouse afterward, in the warm June morning with the street full of wagons and horses and the smell of dust and summer, she turned to face him directly and extended her hand. He took it and felt the calluses from her work and the warmth of her palm, and she shook his hand once firmly and then held it a moment longer than a handshake required. "I owe you a great deal," she said. "You owe me a professional fee," he said, "which I intend to waive, and you owe me nothing else." "That is not true, and you know it," she said, but she was not pressing it into something serious. She was looking at him with those amber eyes and the slight curve at the corner of her mouth that was as close as she tended to get to a full smile in public, and the morning light was doing something irreversible to his capacity for detachment. He held her hand one moment longer. "Opal," he said. "Samuel," she said. They were standing in the middle of Dodge City's Main Street with wagons going past and people moving around them in all directions, and they were looking at each other with the clear, unmistakable awareness of two people who have arrived somewhere important and are deciding whether to step through the door or pretend the door is not there. He was 31 years old and had not been the kind of man who rushed things. But he had discovered over the course of 3 months, the kind of man who was very aware when something genuinely rare was standing in front of him. "Would you do me the honor," he said, "of having dinner with me this evening, not as professional courtesy, as something else?" She looked at him steadily for one moment. "Yes," she said, "I would." He took her to the only restaurant in Dodge City that had linen tablecloths, which was the hotel dining room at the Dodge House, and they sat across from each other in the gold lamplight and ate a real meal and talked. They talked the way people talk when they have been moving carefully around the edges of a conversation for months and have finally been given permission to step inside it. She told him about St. Louis, about the particular grief of losing Jacob, who had been kind and funny and hopeful, about how she had come to terms with his death, not by ceasing to mourn him, but by deciding that the life he had wanted for them was worth continuing to build. She told him that she had been lonely but not defeated, that she had made peace with her own company, but that she also recognized peace with your own company as a different thing from not wanting anyone else's. Samuel told her about Ohio, about his own father who had died when he was 19 and left him responsible for his mother and younger sister, before he had quite finished growing up himself, about why he had come west, which was partly for the practical opportunity, and partly because the scale of the land out here had called to something in him he did not have a full name for. He told her that his work had been satisfying, but that satisfying was not the same as happy, and that he had not spent much time thinking about the difference between the two until recently. She looked at him across the table. "Recently meaning when?" she asked. "Recently meaning about 3 months ago," he said. The slight curve at the corner of her mouth became, briefly, an actual smile, not wide or theatrical but full and genuine, the kind that comes from being pleased without reservation, and it changed her face in a way that made him feel as though he were seeing something that was not shown to just anyone. He walked her to the hotel where she was staying the night before riding home in the morning, and they stood outside in the summer night under the Great Plains sky with its impossible quantity of stars, and she tilted her head back to look up at them for a moment before she said good night. "Come to supper on Sunday," she said. "I will," he said. She went inside, and he stood in the street for a moment looking at the stars she had been looking at, and then he went back to his rooms and did not sleep for some time, but for entirely different reasons than before. The summer moved forward in long golden stretches of days that were warm and full of work. Samuel came to Opal's homestead every Sunday, and some Sundays he came on Saturday as well, and she fed him suppers that were simple and good: beans with cornbread, roast prairie chicken, bread she made herself in the cast-iron Dutch oven, and he helped her with the heavier work without asking, just picking up whatever needed doing and doing it, which was something she accepted without fuss, because she was not the kind of woman who made ceremony out of practical assistance. He fixed the lean-to-barn's back wall where the boards had warped over the winter, rehung the gate on the kitchen garden, and helped her haul stones from the creek to build a low wall along the south side of the garden that would catch heat and extend the growing season. Working beside her was one of the better things he had found in life. She was efficient without being rushed, careful without being slow, and she had the rare quality of being able to work in silence without making the silence feel empty. When they did talk, it was easy and various. They could spend 20 minutes arguing cheerfully about the best method for storing root vegetables through winter, or he would ask her about something she'd read and she would tell him, seriously and at length, what she thought about it, and it was always worth listening to. She had a way of thinking about things that was not what he would have called formal education. She had finished school at 15 when her family needed her to work, but was clear and honest and genuinely her own. In August, he brought her a book he thought she would like, a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and watched her look at it with the pleasure of someone who loves reading and doesn't always have new things to read, turning it carefully in her hands, reading the first page standing in the doorway. "Have you read it?" she asked. "Some of it," he said. "The self-reliance essay particularly." "Why particularly?" She was still reading the first page. "Because it describes," he said carefully, "exactly the kind of person you are." She looked up from the page. The afternoon light was behind him, and he was standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, and she looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things at once, and then she stepped back into the house and said, "Come in, Samuel," in a voice that was gentler than usual. He stepped inside, and she set the book on the table and crossed the room to where he was standing, and she reached up and touched his face with her palm in the simple, direct way she did everything. And he covered her hand with his, and they stood like that for a moment, just looking at each other, the afternoon quiet around them. He kissed her with the careful reverence of a man who understood that this was not something to be careless with. She kissed him back with the directness that was entirely her own, not shy but also not reckless, just fully present, and when they stepped apart they were both breathing a little differently. "I have been thinking," Samuel said, "that I would like to say something to you." "Then say it," she said. "I love you," he said. It was not a prepared speech. It was just the truth, and it came out in the same measured, honest voice he used for everything, which somehow made it more serious than any elaboration would have. Opal looked at him steadily for a moment that felt very long and was in fact quite short. "I know," she said, "and I love you. I have been trying to be sensible about it for about 2 months. Were you successful?" he asked. "No," she said, and the actual full smile came again, both corners of her mouth this time, and her eyes bright with it. He laughed. He had a good laugh she had noticed some time ago, not performed, just genuine, coming from somewhere real. He came to supper on Sunday as always, but this time he brought the minister with him, which was not what she had been expecting, and she stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips and looked between Samuel and the minister with an expression that was somewhere between amazed and amused. "I think," Samuel said from his horse, with the absolute calm of a man who has thought his approach through carefully, "that you deserve to be asked properly. So I am asking properly." He dismounted and held up his hand to the minister to wait, which the minister, who was a practical man who had married many frontier couples, did without complaint. Samuel walked up to the step where Opal stood and looked at her directly. "Opal Brenner," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, her amber eyes clear and steady, and then she stepped down off the step so they were on the same level and said, "Yes, Samuel Sutton, I will." The minister married them in the kitchen garden, between the sunflowers and the bean rows, with the blue August sky overhead and the meadowlarks carrying on in the grass, on the 23rd of August, 1874. There were no guests except the minister and Opal's nearest neighbor, a widow woman named Clara Holt, who had ridden over when she saw the minister's horse, and who cried considerably on their behalf since neither of them was doing it. Samuel wore his best suit, which he had ridden to Dodge City the day before to press, and which was showing the heat already. Opal wore a white dress with blue embroidery at the collar that she had made herself from cloth she had been keeping for an occasion she hadn't named yet. She was beautiful in it. He told her so plainly directly after the minister finished and before he kissed her, and she put her hand on his chest and looked up at him with those clear amber eyes and said, "We are going to be all right," in a voice that was steady and certain and full of everything she meant. "Yes," he said, "we are." The minister stayed for supper, and Clara Holt stayed for supper as well, and Samuel opened the bottle of whiskey he had brought in his saddlebag, and they ate and drank and talked around the table while the prairie evening came down soft and blew through the cabin windows, and it was the finest meal any of them could remember having. Harland Cass was not finished. Samuel had perhaps allowed himself to hope that the federal adjudication ruling would be enough to make the man let go. He had been realistic about the probability of this, not very high, he had told himself, but he had allowed himself a measure of hope because he was newly married and the summer had been golden, and it is difficult to maintain rigorous pessimism in those circumstances. In September, 3 of Opal's fence posts along the eastern boundary were pulled out and dumped in the creek. She found them on a Tuesday morning and wrote to Samuel at the land office, and he rode out that afternoon. The posts had not simply fallen, they had been pulled and carried some distance to the creek, which required effort and intent. The corner stake nearest the creek had not been touched, which was probably because whoever had come knew it would be noticed and documented. Samuel set his jaw and went to see the county sheriff. The sheriff's name was Merriman, a burly, weathered man who had been sheriff of the county for 7 years, and who was no particular friend of Harland Cass's, but who was also no particular enemy of his either, occupying the careful neutral ground that many frontier lawmen found safer than taking sides in disputes between large landowners and small ones. Samuel laid out the situation plainly. He showed Merriman the land office ruling. He told him about the fence posts. He said that if this was the beginning of a campaign of harassment against his wife's property, he wanted it on record with the county sheriff's office before it escalated. Merriman rubbed his chin. "Can you prove Cass sent whoever pulled those posts?" "I cannot prove it," Samuel said. "But I can tell you that no other person in this county has a demonstrated interest in causing damage to that particular section of my wife's fence line." Merriman looked at the ceiling. "I'll ride out and have a word with Cass." "I would appreciate that," Samuel said. Whether Merriman's conversation with Cass had any effect, or whether it was the federal ruling and the solid documentation already in the land office files that finally made the calculation unfavorable, or whether it was simply that winter was coming and Cass had other things to concern himself with, the harassment stopped after the fence posts. No more damage was done to Opal's property. No more legal filings were made. The competing claim remained dismissed and showed no signs of resurrection. By October, Samuel had moved his belongings from his rented room in Dodge City to the Brenner homestead, which was a more involved process than it sounds, because his belongings included his full surveying equipment, a substantial collection of maps and field notebooks accumulated over 7 years, a good rifle, 3 changes of clothes, a crate of books, and a rocking chair that he had bought in Ohio before leaving it, and that had followed him west out of some stubborn attachment he could not entirely explain. Opal made room for all of it without complaint, and rearranged the cabin's interior with the decisive practicality that characterized her approach to all logistical problems. She put his surveying equipment in the lean-to barn where it was protected from weather. She made a shelf for the books beside her own books, which he approved of because it meant their reading was now intermingled in a way that suggested permanence. She looked at the rocking chair for a moment, and then placed it beside the stove, and said it was a good chair for reading in winter, which was true. He fell into the life of the homestead with an ease that surprised him, though perhaps it should not have. He was a man who had always done better with physical work than without it, and the homestead provided an unlimited supply of practical problems that needed solving. He understood structures and mathematics and the properties of land, all of which were directly applicable to the work of keeping a claim in good repair and growing. Opal was better at the farming itself. The knowledge of seasons and soil and plant behavior that she had accumulated over 5 years was considerably beyond his. But he was a fast learner, and she was a patient and unsentimental teacher. And within the span of a single autumn, he had learned more about dryland farming than he had expected to absorb in a lifetime. They had the kind of marriage that is built on the foundation of genuine mutual respect, which is the most durable kind. They argued sometimes. She was firm in her opinions and did not soften them to avoid friction, and he was methodical and occasionally stubborn about processes. But their arguments were of the productive variety, the kind that ended in solutions rather than injuries, and they both understood instinctively the difference between disagreement and disrespect. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was long and cold, and they weathered it together. Snow came in November and stayed, piling along the fence lines and drifting against the barn, and they spent the darkest months inside the warm cabin eating from the stores they had put up through the fall, reading beside the stove, talking through the evenings in the particular quiet of a snowbound plains winter. He read Emerson aloud to her sometimes, and she listened and commented sharply and often helpfully on passages she disagreed with, which he found more interesting than reading alone. She taught him to play chess on a board she had made from painted squares of wood with carved pieces that Jacob had made the first winter, and he was a quick study, and within a month was giving her genuine competition, which pleased him and amused her. In January, they learned that she was expecting a child. She told him on a Wednesday evening, setting a cup of coffee in front of him at the table and then sitting down across from him and saying it simply and directly, the way she said all things. He sat with this information for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and what she saw in his face made her expression soften in that way that was only for him. "Are you well?" he asked. "I feel perfectly well," she said. "I expect I will feel rather less well presently from what I understand, but right now I feel well." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Opal," he said, and could not immediately follow it with words which she seemed to understand because she pressed his hand and waited. "I am very glad," he said finally. "So am I," she said. The child arrived in September of 1875, a boy strong and loud and clear about his opinions from the first moment, which caused Samuel to look at Opal and say, "He is yours, that's certain." And she looked at him and then at the red-faced furious baby and said, "He has your ears, so he is yours as well," which made Clara Holt, who had come to help with the birth, laugh so hard she had to sit down. They named him Jacob Samuel Sutton, the first name for the man who had built the ground they stood on, the second for the man who had come to stand on it beside her. It seemed right to both of them. There was no grief in the naming, or very little. There was instead a kind of honoring, an acknowledgement that the life they were living had been built on everything that had come before it, and that was not something to avoid but something to carry forward. Jacob Samuel was a spirited baby who slept in intervals and ate with enthusiasm, and watched everything around him with the intent amber eyes he had inherited from his mother. Samuel found fatherhood to be considerably more disorienting than he had anticipated, and considerably more transformative. He had not understood before it happened what it would do to the interior of a man to have a child look at him as though he were the most solid and trustworthy thing in the known world, and to feel the weight of that look and want, with a seriousness that exceeded anything he had previously wanted, to deserve it. He spent the fall of 1875 building an addition onto the cabin, a second room, properly framed and floored, with a window looking south over the kitchen garden. Opal helped him with the framing when the baby slept, holding boards in place with the same easy competence she brought to everything, and they built it together over the course of 6 weeks, working in the warm fall afternoons. When it was finished and the window was in and the floor was laid, she stood in it and looked around at the afternoon light coming through the south window, and said it was the finest room she had ever been in, which he knew was not strictly true, but understood she meant genuinely. Harland Cass's cattle operation ran into difficulties the following spring, when the prolonged drought that hit the Kansas plains in 1876 hit his unfenced range particularly hard. Cattle operations that depended on open range were vulnerable to drought in ways that diversified homestead operations were not. The homestead's kitchen garden had deep root systems. The crops were chosen for drought tolerance, and Samuel had, on Opal's suggestion, and with the help of a textbook he had ordered from a publisher in Cincinnati, dug out and expanded the storage cistern to capture spring rain. Cass, by contrast, was moving cattle through range that had dried to bare dirt, and by midsummer it was known throughout the county that he was in significant financial trouble. He came to the Brenner homestead in August of 1876, alone, without his lawyer. He rode up on a good horse that was beginning to show the signs of a man who had been spending money he no longer had, and he sat in the yard and waited for someone to come out. Samuel came out first and stood on the step with his arms at his sides and looked at the man who had spent 2 years trying to take his wife's land, and waited. Cass was older than Samuel had expected, in his mid-50s, with a weathered face and the look of a man who had spent a long time being certain he was right about things. He did not look certain about very much at present. "I understand your wife is the claimant of record on this homestead," Cass said. "She is," Samuel said. Opal came to stand beside him, having heard the horse and come to the door with young Jacob on her hip, the boy regarding the stranger with calm amber-eyed interest. Cass looked at Opal Brenner Sutton for a moment. "I've come to say that I'm withdrawing any remaining interest in this parcel," he said. "I should have let it go 2 years ago. The boundary dispute was—" He stopped. "My lawyer advised me the filing had merit. I should have looked at the documents myself." There was a silence. The baby patted Opal's collar with one small hand, bored with the adult proceedings. Opal looked at Cass for a moment with the steady measuring look that she gave to situations that required assessment. "Mr. Cass," she said, "I accept that, and I will say that whatever difficulties you are presently experiencing with your range, I hope they resolve themselves." Samuel looked at her briefly. She was not a woman who performed magnanimity. If she said it, she meant it. Cass looked slightly surprised. He touched his hat and rode out, and they watched him go. And then Opal shifted the baby to her other hip and went back inside, and Samuel followed her, and she put the kettle on and said nothing further about it, because it was done. The years that followed were good ones, which is to say they were years of hard work and deep satisfaction, and the incremental building of something durable. By 1878, the homestead had grown to include a properly built barn to replace the lean-to, a chicken house, a root cellar dug into the south slope, and 40 acres under cultivation in addition to the pasture and the garden. The eastern boundary ran exactly where Peterson's field notes had always said it ran, marked by the original corner stakes and the additional ones Samuel had added, and the creek turned silver and busy every spring and quiet in the dry summers and frozen over in the coldest winters, and it was theirs, solidly and permanently and undeniably theirs. Young Jacob Samuel, at 3 years old, was an intrepid and somewhat alarming child who had his mother's stubborn competence and his father's methodical curiosity, combined into a small person who thought nothing of wandering to the creek to examine things, and who had to be watched with considerable attention. He spoke in clear, full sentences early and asked questions constantly, and was, Samuel thought, going to be either a lawyer or a scientist or a significant inconvenience to someone in authority, possibly all three. In the spring of 1878, Clara Holt came to Opal with her hat in her hands and said she was thinking of selling her property and going to live with her daughter in Wichita, and that if Opal wanted the parcel next door she should say so before someone else bought it. The parcel was 80 acres adjoining the Brenner claim's western boundary, good grass land with a seasonal creek of its own. Samuel and Opal sat at their table that evening after Jacob was in bed and talked about it for a long time. They had money saved, not a great deal, but more than most people in their situation, because Opal had always been careful and Samuel had continued to do surveying work on contract through the county, working 3 days a week from the homestead and keeping the land office work on a case-by-case basis that suited his domestic life. They could afford the parcel if they were willing to extend themselves somewhat. "What do you think?" she asked him. "I think it is good land and a fair price, and that your instinct about land has been correct every time," he said. "That is very diplomatic," she said, with a slight corner curve. "I also think," he said more directly, That this homestead was yours first, and everything we add to it should be yours by choice, so I will support whatever you decide." She looked at him steadily across the table, and there was something in her expression that was not quite the measuring look she gave to strategic situations, but was something more personal appreciation, maybe, or the recognition of something she had known for some time but which still moved her. "It was hours from the moment you filed that correction notice," she said. "You know that." He did know that. He had known it, he thought, from the moment he stood in her barn and heard her say she had been rival to worse and believed her completely. They bought Clara Holt's 80 acres in May of 1878, and Clara went to Wichita with a sum that would take care of her comfortably, and Samuel surveyed the new parcel himself and added it to the homestead's legal description, with the precision of a man who had learned from experience that a good survey description is worth more than any fence. Their second child was born in November of 1878, a second boy, whom they named Thomas William Sutton, the William for Samuel's younger brother back in Ohio, who had married and settled and who corresponded regularly. Thomas was quieter than Jacob had been, a watchful, solemn baby who observed the world from under heavy dark brows with what appeared to be serious scholarly interest, and who smiled when he decided to smile with the full committed warmth of someone who does not smile carelessly. Jacob was 3 and deeply important about the arrival of his brother, taking his position as elder immediately and with great solemnity, bringing Thomas small offerings from around the yard, a pebble, a feather, a dried bean, which he placed beside the baby with the gravity of someone performing significant rituals. Samuel and Opal watched their sons from the doorway of the cabin one spring afternoon the following year, Jacob holding Thomas upright in the grass, while Thomas practiced the not yet mastered art of standing, both of them lit by the afternoon sun, and Opal took Samuel's hand without looking at him. "Do you remember," she said, "when you came to tell me about the competing claim?" "I remember," he said. "You were building a window frame. You stood in my barn and looked at me like you were not sure whether I was going to ask you to leave." "I was not sure," he admitted. "I thought," she said, "that you were going to be another person telling me what was being taken from me." She paused, watching the boys in the grass. "And instead you were the person who helped me keep it." He turned to look at her profile in the afternoon light, the dark red hair going slightly to copper at the temples in her early 30s, the calm, steady face that was still as direct and clear as the first day he'd seen it. "I want to say something," he said. She turned to look at him and waited. "I came here the first morning to deliver a legal notice," he said, "because it was my job and it needed to be done. But I came back the second morning because something in you would not let me just ride away." He paused, finding the words he had been finding more easily in recent years. "Every good thing in my life since then has been because of you. Not because of what I did, but because you were worth doing it for." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she only did when she was letting the composed, careful exterior rest, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the doorway of the cabin they had expanded and repaired and made into something solid, watching their 2 boys in the grass of the homestead that was theirs in every way a thing can be yours, legally, practically, physically, and in the particular deep sense that comes from having fought for something and kept it. "Samuel," she said, against his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "I was very glad you came back." "So was I," he said. "I expect I will continue to be." She lifted her head and looked at him with the full smile, both corners, real and unheld, the one that was only for him, and he kissed her there in the doorway of their home with the afternoon sun warm on both of them. And Thomas fell down in the grass with a thump, and lay there looking up at the sky with philosophical acceptance, and Jacob crouched beside him to offer a pebble, and the meadowlarks were carrying on in the grass beyond the kitchen garden. And somewhere in the cottonwoods by the eastern boundary, the creek ran over its shallow rocks in the direction it had always run, along the bearing that Peterson had noted correctly in his field notes 43 degrees north and east, marking the edge of everything that was theirs. In the winter of 1879, a letter arrived from Samuel's brother William in Ohio, saying that their mother was in declining health and asking whether Samuel might be able to visit before the following spring. Samuel and Opal talked about it carefully and decided that all four of them would go. It was time Jacob and Thomas knew their grandmother, and it was time Samuel's family saw what the life he had built looked like. They arranged for a neighboring family to watch the property for the 2 months they would be gone, boarded up the windows against the winter storms, and made the journey east in February, which was cold and long, and involved the boys being confined to a railway car for an extended period, which Jacob found fascinating and Thomas found suitable for extended napping. William's family welcomed them warmly, and Samuel's mother, frail but clear-minded, took one look at Opal and then at Samuel and then back at Opal and said, in the direct way that Samuel realized he had probably inherited, "She is exactly right for you," which made Opal laugh, a real full laugh, the one that opened her face entirely, and made Samuel feel exactly as he had felt on the step of the cabin with her arm in the afternoon sun 3 years before. His mother recovered that winter, as it turned out, improving through March with the stubbornness of a woman who has decided she is not finished yet. They stayed through April, and in that time Opal sat with Samuel's mother on many evenings and they talked about the territory and about farming and about what it meant to build a life in hard country. Two women who understood the substance of that question from the inside, and Samuel listened from across the room and thought that he was the luckiest man in any county in Kansas. They came home in May of 1879 to the homestead fresh and green in the spring, the kitchen garden already showing its first green rose through the rich dark soil, the sunflowers along the fence not yet bloomed but coming. Jacob ran from the wagon to the garden fence and stood looking at it with the proprietary satisfaction of someone returning to something that is theirs, and Thomas sat in Samuel's arms and looked at the cabin with his solemn, heavy brows and then pointed at it and said clearly, with great conviction, "Home," which was the longest and most definitive sentence he had yet produced. "Yes," Samuel told him, "home." The summer of 1879 was the best growing season in 5 years, warm and with enough rain to fill the cistern twice. The corn grew tall and the beans ran up their poles, and the kitchen garden produced a surplus that Opal preserved in glass jars through July and August, until the root cellar shelf was full, and they had to start giving the rest away to neighbors, which she did without hesitation, and with the straightforward generosity of someone who had been helped in hard times and understood it as a form of practical community rather than charity. Clara Holt wrote from Wichita to say she was doing well and that her daughter had a new baby and that she was glad to know the land was being well kept. Opal wrote back with detailed and affectionate accounts of the sunflowers along the fence line that Clara had always admired, and of Jacob's increasingly elaborate projects in the barn, and of Thomas's philosophical temperament, and of the survey measurements Samuel had done in the spring to add a kitchen extension to the east side of the cabin because the family had grown, and the single room with the sleeping alcove was no longer quite enough for 4 people and their respective tendencies to spread. The extension went up in the fall, properly framed and weather-tight, and it had its own window looking east toward the creek boundary and the cottonwoods that turned gold in October. Samuel set a second chair beside the stove in the main room and placed his rocking chair near the east window, where it caught the morning light, and Opal's books and his books were long since fully intermingled on the shelves, indistinguishable by ownership, which was how it should be. Jacob turned 5 and began his formal education, which Opal conducted herself from a set of primers she ordered from a bookseller, and from her own considerable stock of knowledge about how to present information to someone who was interested in everything simultaneously. He was a quick and relentless student who read above his age within the first year and who had questions about everything he read, which Opal answered directly and completely when she could and honestly when she could not, saying when she did not know something, "I don't know. Let us find out," which Samuel thought was the most valuable piece of education a person could receive. Thomas, at 2, watched his brother's lessons with the same philosophical interest he brought to everything, occasionally contributing remarks that were difficult to interpret but were clearly regarded by Thomas himself as pertinent. In January of 1880, when both boys were in bed and the snow was coming down outside in the blue Kansas winter dark, Samuel and Opal sat at their table across from each other with their after-supper coffee and the quiet that was not emptiness but fullness, the quiet of a life that has settled into itself, and Opal said, "I have been thinking about the East Field." "What about it?" Samuel asked. "If we put winter wheat in it this year instead of corn, we could rotate the south field to corn and rest the north pasture for the grazing season." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had come to Kansas with a wagon and $200 and had grown that into this. The homestead now running to 240 acres, the barn solid and well-maintained, the kitchen garden producing in 4 seasons, 2 boys asleep in the new East Room, the land clean and well-surveyed and hers in every legal and practical sense. "That is a good plan," he said. She looked at him with the slight curve that was always the beginning of the full smile. "You say that every time." "You are usually right," he said. "Not always," she said. "Close enough," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the hand with the calluses from the work, the warm, certain hand that he had first held outside the courthouse in Dodge City on a summer morning 6 years ago, and looked at him with those clear amber eyes that had not changed. That were the same measuring, steady eyes that had looked at him across a barn the first morning he had ridden up with a notice in his breast pocket and a job to do that had turned out to be the best thing he had ever been sent to do. "I am glad," she said, "that Harland Cass filed that competing claim." He blinked. "That is not something I expected you to say." "If he had not," she said with complete logical seriousness, "you would have ridden by and delivered the original survey correction to the land office by mail and I never would have met you." He thought about this. "That is terrifying," he said. "It is," she agreed. "So I am glad, despite everything, that he was greedy enough to overreach. It brought you to my barn." He turned his hand over and held hers. "You were building a window frame," he said. "I was. And you told me you had been rival to worse." "I had been," she said. "I believed you," he said, immediately and completely. She smiled, the full one, both corners, real and unheld. And the lamplight was warm on both of them, and the snow was coming down outside over the dark plains, over the kitchen garden and the fence line with its sunflower stalks dried and standing through the winter, over the corner stakes along the creek that marked the boundary that had been correctly surveyed all along, over the good solid cabin with its east extension and its 2 sleeping rooms and its shelves of intermingled books and its rocking chair by the morning window. "Samuel Sutton," she said. "Opal Brenner Sutton," he said. She squeezed his hand once, warmly, and picked up her coffee, and outside the snow went on coming down in the blue Kansas winter night, and inside the lamp burned steadily, and the 2 of them sat together at their table in the life they had built, and it was good, and it was theirs, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. The spring of 1880 came in early and bright, warmer than usual, with the first green pushing through the brown grass on the south slope before March was halfway through. Samuel stood at the east window with his morning coffee, looking out at the creek visible through the bare cottonwood branches, and listened to the particular quality of the sound coming from the new room, Jacob explaining something to Thomas with the earnest thoroughness of a 5-year-old teacher, and Thomas responding with the one-word observations that were his characteristic style. Opal came and stood beside him with her own coffee and looked out at the same view. "The cottonwoods will be out in 2 weeks," she said. "The east field will be ready to turn the week after," he said. They stood in comfortable silence looking out at the land that was greening up around them. The land with its correctly surveyed boundaries, and its deep-rooted garden, and its kitchen extension, and its two boys waking up in the room behind them. And the spring light was coming through the window at the angle that made the amber in Opal's eyes go gold. And Samuel thought of the morning he had ridden up this same drive with a notice in his breast pocket, and thought of the hammer sound from the barn, and thought of her standing up from her workbench and looking at him with the steady measuring eyes, and thought that there was nothing in the life of a man more worth doing than being worthy of. Someone who had looked at you that way and decided, after careful and thorough assessment, to let you stay. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into it, which she always did when the boys were not watching and sometimes when they were. And they stood at the east window looking at their land in the spring morning light, and the meadowlarks were back, carrying on in the greening grass beyond the fence line. And somewhere along the creek, the cottonwood buds were swelling toward their opening, and the world was starting over again in the way that the world on the plains always did. Persistent and unhurried and entirely indifferent to anything, except the continuing work of being alive and growing. "Are you happy?" she asked, not with doubt but with the directness of someone who asks the real question because they want the real answer. "Yes," he said, in the voice he used when he meant something without qualification. "Completely." She made a small sound that was not quite a word but was clearly satisfied and finished her coffee and set the cup down on the windowsill. "Then let us get to work," she said, and they did. Together, as they always did, on the land that was theirs, under the wide Kansas sky, on the good solid ground that had been accurately surveyed and legally confirmed and fought for and kept, that had been a homestead filing first and then a life, and then a family and then everything, that had started with a woman nailing a window frame and a man who rode up one spring morning with difficult news and had enough sense, and enough decency, and enough heart, to come back the next morning with something better.